For 50 years, Susan and I had what most people would call the perfect marriage. We built a life together in Raleigh, North Carolina, from nothing but hard work and commitment. I met Susan in the summer of 1974 at a 4th of July barbecue hosted by mutual friends. Back then, I was 25 and climbing the corporate ladder in Atlanta, and she was 21, balancing college and part-time work. Susan had this way of drawing everyone in with her warm smile and quick wit. It didn't take long for me to realize I wanted to spend my life with her. Our first home was a modest 2-bedroom house. I worked long hours at an entry-level position, and Susan handled the household. As the years passed, we upgraded to a larger home, raised 3 wonderful children, and even managed to travel the world once we retired. From the outside, our life seemed idyllic: weekend barbecues, family gatherings, and a bond that everyone envied. I believed we were unshakable. Last month, our children threw us a party for our golden anniversary. Family and friends came from all over to celebrate our milestone. I watched as Susan smiled and laughed, sharing old stories. She was always a gracious hostess, knowing exactly how to make everyone feel welcome. That night, I thought I was the luckiest man alive. But now, I wonder if I was just blind. Over the past year, subtle changes started creeping into our routine. Susan began going out more often, meeting friends I had never heard of before. She also took up new hobbies, like yoga, which was surprising because she'd always laughed at the idea of group exercise. At first, I thought she was just enjoying her retirement and exploring new interests. After all, she'd sacrificed so much for our family over the years. But something didn't sit right. The biggest change was her phone. Susan was never one to care much about technology, but suddenly, her phone was always in her hand. She kept it close, even during meals, and whenever it buzzed, she'd glance at the screen and tilt it away from me. When I asked about it, she'd shrug and say it was just a message from one of the girls. I tried to believe her, but her behavior was different, more guarded. One Sunday morning, Susan casually mentioned that she was meeting an old friend for coffee. That wasn't unusual, but her tone and body language felt off. She didn't meet my eyes as she spoke, and her smile didn't reach her eyes. I brushed it off, telling myself I was reading too much into it. But as I watched her walk out the door, something unfamiliar crept into my mind, an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. For 50 years, I had absolute trust in Susan. She had been my partner, my confidant, and my greatest ally. But for the first time in our long marriage, I found myself questioning the foundation we had built together. The following weeks were filled with questions I couldn't answer. Susan's behavior grew stranger by the day, and no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, my gut told me something was off. She had always been an open book with me, but now it felt like she was closing chapters before I could even read them. Take her newfound obsession with yoga, for example. Susan had never been the active type. She used to joke that her favorite exercise was walking from the car to the store. Now, she was going to classes 3 times a week, each session lasting longer than the last. When I asked her about it, she'd smile and say, "It's good for the soul, George. You should try it sometime." But she never invited me along. Then there were her new friends. Susan mentioned a woman named Linda who she had supposedly met at yoga. Linda this, Linda that, it was like Linda was her new best friend. Yet, whenever I asked if I could meet her, Susan would brush me off. "Oh, she's busy," she'd say, or, "You wouldn't have much in common." The excuses piled up faster than I could process them. One evening, while Susan was out at yoga, I decided to tidy up the living room. Her laptop was sitting on the coffee table, still open to her email inbox. I'd never been one to snoop, trust had always been the cornerstone of our marriage, but something about the way she had been acting made me pause. Against my better judgment, I sat down and clicked. Her inbox was a mix of spam, yoga class confirmations, and one email from someone named R. The subject line read, "Tonight was amazing." My hands hovered over the mouse, unsure if I should click. But curiosity got the better of me. The email wasn't long, but it said everything I needed to know. Can't stop thinking about you. You looked stunning tonight. Same time next week? It hit me like a ton of bricks. Susan wasn't spending her evenings stretching and meditating, she was meeting someone else. My mind raced with questions. Who was How long had this been going on? And, most importantly, why? When she came home that night, I kept quiet. I watched her move around the house, humming to herself like everything was normal. But nothing felt normal to me. Not anymore. I decided I wouldn't confront her just yet. I needed proof, solid, undeniable proof. If Susan was willing to throw away 50 years of marriage, I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind was already forming a plan. Susan thought she could keep secrets from me, but she had underestimated just how far I was willing to go to uncover the truth. The next morning, I couldn't shake the email from my mind. Every word replayed in my head, and every glance at Susan felt like a spotlight on her secrets. I knew I needed more than just one email if I was going to confront her. I needed irrefutable proof, something so damning that there would be no room for denial, no chance for manipulation. Susan's yoga nights became my opportunity. The next time she left the house, I waited 20 minutes, then grabbed my keys and followed her. I'd never done anything like this before, but something inside me had snapped. 50 years of trust were on the line, and I wasn't going to let her lies go unchecked. She didn't go to yoga. Instead, she drove to a restaurant across town, a dimly lit place that we hadn't visited in years. I parked a few spots away and watched as she walked inside. She wasn't dressed for yoga, and she was wearing the same navy blue dress she'd worn to our last anniversary dinner, paired with heels she hadn't touched in months. I waited, my hands gripping the steering wheel. Part of me wanted to storm inside and demand answers, but I knew that wouldn't give me the closure I needed. I wanted to see everything, no half-truths, no excuses. A few minutes later, a man joined her at the table by the window. He looked to be in his early 60s, with grey hair and a smug confidence that made my blood boil. They were sitting close, too close for just friends. I watched as he reached across the table and took her hand. She didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled, a smile I hadn't seen in years. I stayed in the car for what felt like an eternity, watching them laugh, talk, and lean into each other. The betrayal cut deeper with every second. Eventually, I grabbed my phone and snapped a few photos through the windshield. They weren't perfect, but they were clear enough to show Susan's hand resting on his arm. That night, she came home like nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek and asked about my day, as if she hadn't spent the evening with another man. I played along, hiding the storm brewing inside me. Over the next week, I dug deeper. I installed a small tracking device on her car, a simple, legal tool that could record where she went and when. I also searched our credit card statements. It didn't take long to find the charges, a fancy dinner here, a hotel stay there. It was all adding up. The final straw came when I checked her phone one morning while she was in the shower. She hadn't bothered to change her password, assuming I'd never look. What I found was worse than I imagined, dozens of texts from the same man, messages filled with flirtation, plans for their next meeting, and even a few photos I'd rather not describe. I had everything I needed now. Susan thought she could deceive me, but she was wrong. This wasn't going to end quietly. I waited for the perfect moment to confront Susan, and it didn't take long for it to present itself. The following Saturday, she announced that she was heading out for another yoga class. She stood in front of the mirror, carefully applying makeup, a routine I hadn't seen her take so seriously in years. Her yoga mat leaned against the door, untouched, as though it was just another prop in her performance. "You look nice," I said, watching her adjust her necklace. Thanks, she replied, avoiding my eyes. It's just a casual class. Casual. Sure. I nodded and said nothing, letting her think I was none the wiser. She left the house as usual, but this time, I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. I already had everything I needed: photos, text messages, receipts. The only thing left to do was lay it all out in front of her. When she returned that evening, she acted as though it had been any other day. She kissed me on the cheek and asked if I'd eaten dinner yet. The audacity of her calm demeanor made my blood boil. "Susan," I said, my tone calm but firm, "we need to talk." She froze for a moment before turning to face me. "About what?" "About I said, watching her face for any flicker of recognition. And there it was, a subtle twitch of her eye, a brief falter in her posture. She knew exactly what I was talking about. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, forcing a laugh. "Don't insult my intelligence, Susan," I said, reaching for the folder I'd prepared. I placed it on the table between us and opened it, revealing the photos, the credit card statements, and the text message screenshots. "Explain this." Her face went pale. For a moment, she said nothing, her eyes darting between the evidence and me. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, she dropped the act. "Fine," she said, crossing her arms. "You caught me. Are you happy now?" "Happy?" I repeated, incredulous. "You've been lying to me for God knows how long, and you think I'm looking for happiness?" "What I want is the truth." Susan rolled her eyes. "The truth? You really want to know?" "Fine. Yes, I've been seeing someone. His name is Richard, and he makes me feel alive, something you haven't done in years." Her words hit like a slap, but I refused to let her see it. 50 years, Susan. 50 years of marriage, of sacrifices, of building a life together. "And this is how you repay me?" She scoffed. "Oh, don't play the victim, George. You've been checked out for years. All you care about is your little projects and your routine." I needed more. I took a deep breath, refusing to let her bait me into an argument. "If you were unhappy, you should have said something. But instead, you chose to betray me. That's on you, Susan. Not me." For the first time, she looked shaken. Her confidence wavered as she realized I wasn't going to back down. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice quieter now. I stood up, my gaze steady. "You'll find out soon enough," I said, leaving her alone with the folder of evidence. That night, I called my lawyer. It was time to take the next step, and I was done playing the fool. After that night, something in me changed. For 50 years, I had lived by the rules, working hard, being loyal, putting family above all else. But Susan had shattered the foundation of everything we'd built together, and now I was determined to make her feel the weight of her betrayal. I wasn't going to yell or beg. That would be too easy for her. No, I was going to play this smart. The first thing I did was lock down the finances. I contacted my bank and opened a new account in my name only, transferring half of our joint savings into it. Legally, I was entitled to do so, and I wasn't about to let her drain the accounts for her little rendezvous. I froze the credit cards and called the companies to ensure she couldn't open new lines of credit without my consent. If she wanted to keep living her new life with Richard, she'd have to do it without the money I'd spent decades earning. Next, I met with my lawyer, Ted, a sharp, no-nonsense man who had seen it all. I laid out the evidence I'd collected, the photos, the receipts, the texts. Ted nodded as he flipped through the folder. "This is solid," he said. "We can use this to negotiate a favorable settlement. She won't walk away with much." But I wasn't satisfied with just cutting her off financially. Susan had humiliated me, and I wanted to return the favor. That's when I came up with the idea for the family meeting. The following weekend, I invited our children and grandchildren over for what I called a special announcement. Susan was visibly nervous when I told her about it, but she didn't protest. I think she assumed I was going to make some sentimental speech about our marriage. She couldn't have been more wrong. When everyone arrived, I waited until we were all seated in the living room. Susan sat beside me, smiling awkwardly as the kids joked and caught up with one another. I stood up, cleared my throat, and said, "Thank you all for coming. I have something important to share." Susan's smile faltered. "I've always believed in honesty and transparency," I began. "And that's why I think it's time to let you all know what's been happening behind closed doors." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folder of evidence. "Your mother," I said, my voice steady, "has been having an affair with a man named Richard." The room went silent. Susan's face turned as white as the couch she was sitting on. Our eldest son, Mark, was the first to speak. "Dad, what are you talking about?" I opened the folder and handed the photos and texts to Mark. He looked through them, his expression darkening with every page. "Is this true, Mom?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Susan stammered, her usual confidence completely gone. "It's not what it looks like," she said weakly. "It's exactly what it looks like," I interrupted. "She's been lying to all of us, sneaking around, and spending money from our accounts to fund her little dates with Richard." The grandchildren, too young to understand the full gravity of the situation, looked confused as their parents exchanged angry glances. Susan tried to defend herself, but the damage was done. Our children were furious, not just at her, but at the sheer disrespect she had shown to our family. "How could you do this?" Mark demanded. "After everything Dad's done for you?" I stayed quiet as the kids took turns expressing their disappointment. Susan's excuses grew weaker and weaker until she finally fell silent. When the meeting was over, I stood at the door as everyone left. Mark stopped and placed a hand on my shoulder. "We're here for you, Dad," he said. "Whatever you need." Susan didn't say a word as she walked to the bedroom, her head bowed. That night, I slept in the guest room. It was the first step toward reclaiming my life. The morning after the family meeting, Susan was a shadow of her former self. Her usual confidence had been replaced with silence and avoidance. But I wasn't done. She might have thought the worst was over, but for me, it was just the beginning. First, I wanted to make sure Richard, her so-called escape from boredom, felt the consequences too. I knew enough about him from the texts and emails. He owned a small real estate office in town and had a reputation as a charmer. With a little digging, I discovered something interesting. His office had a strict no-fraternization policy. If he got caught in an affair, it wouldn't just hurt his personal life, it would put his job at risk. I contacted a private investigator I'd hired earlier to gather more information. Within days, I had photos of Richard and Susan together at a hotel, holding hands at a park, and even kissing in the parking lot behind his office. The investigator also uncovered a trail of questionable financial transactions linked to Richard's business. He wasn't just a cheater, he was sloppy, too. Armed with this information, I made an anonymous call to his company's HR department. "I think you might want to take a look at your employee Richard," I said calmly. "I have some photos and evidence that might violate your workplace policies." I emailed them the evidence and left it at that. A few days later, I heard through the grapevine that Richard had been placed on leave pending an internal investigation. It wasn't long before he was quietly let go. Word spread quickly in our town, and his reputation took a nosedive. Meanwhile, I continued tightening the screws at home. Susan had no idea that I had already filed for divorce. My lawyer worked quickly, ensuring that the papers included a clear division of assets. I wasn't interested in leaving her destitute, just enough to make sure she understood what she'd thrown away. When I served her the divorce papers, she broke down in tears. "George, please," she begged. "We can fix this. I'll end things with Richard. I'll do whatever it takes." Her desperation was almost laughable. "Fix this?" I said, shaking my head. "You didn't seem too interested in fixing anything when you were sneaking around behind my back. This isn't about us anymore, Susan. This is about me taking back my life." She tried every trick in the book, apologies, promises, even guilt trips about our history together. But I wasn't falling for it. I told her I'd already made my decision, and nothing she said would change it. To make matters worse for her, I'd decided to sell the house. It was too full of memories, both good and bad, and I needed a fresh start. Susan was furious. "You can't sell this house. It's our home." "It was our home," I corrected. "Now it's just another reminder of how much you took for granted." The listing went up the following week, and within days, we had offers. I made sure Susan understood that her share of the proceeds would go directly into a separate account, not into her hands. I wasn't about to let her use it to fund her new life with Richard. The walls were closing in on her, and I could see the panic in her eyes. She had spent years living comfortably, relying on me to provide for her. Now, she was staring down the barrel of a very different reality. But I wasn't done yet. Richard might have lost his job, but I had one final move to make sure neither of them forgot the price of their betrayal. As the house sale progressed and the divorce proceedings moved forward, I realized I had one last card to play, something that would make both Susan and Richard understand the full extent of what they'd done. I wasn't just looking for closure. I wanted to make this unforgettable. By this point, Richard had already lost his job. Word had spread about his affair, and his personal and professional reputation were in shambles. Susan was spiraling too. Her once perfect image as the devoted wife and mother was tarnished, and she now faced the reality of living without the financial stability she'd taken for granted. But it still wasn't enough. They needed to feel what betrayal really cost. I reached out to a mutual friend of Susan's and mine, a woman named Evelyn, who had a knack for organizing events. She owed me a favor, so I asked her to host a small celebration at her home under the guise of a farewell party for me, as I prepared to move out of the house. Evelyn didn't ask too many questions, but she knew something big was coming. Susan, unaware of my true intentions, eagerly agreed to attend. She probably thought this was my attempt to make peace or soften the blow of our divorce. She even offered to bring a dish to share, as if everything between us could go back to normal. The party was set for a Saturday evening. Family, friends, neighbors, and even some of Susan's yoga acquaintances showed up. Susan was her usual charming self, mingling with guests, laughing, and pretending that her life wasn't falling apart. I let her bask in the attention, for a while. When most of the guests had arrived, I stood up and called for everyone's attention. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I began, holding up my glass. "This gathering isn't just a farewell for me. It's also a moment to reflect on the truth." Susan's smile faltered, but she kept her composure. "George, what are you talking about?" she asked, her voice just loud enough for the room to hear. "Oh, you'll see," I replied calmly. I gestured toward the large flat-screen TV mounted on Evelyn's living room wall. Evelyn, who was in on the plan, dimmed the lights and hit play on the slideshow I had prepared. The first image was a photo of Susan and Richard at the restaurant, holding hands. The next was of them walking into a hotel together. Then came the screenshots of their text messages, messages filled with flirtation and plans for secret meetings. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Susan, who was frozen in place, her face a mask of horror. Some of the guests gasped, and others whispered among themselves. One of her yoga friends muttered, "Oh my God, Susan." Susan tried to interrupt. "George, stop this," she shouted, her voice cracking. I ignored her and continued. "For 50 years, I believed in this woman. I gave her everything I had, my trust, my loyalty, my love. And this is how she repaid me." I turned to face her. "You didn't just betray me, Susan. You betrayed our family, our friends, and everything we built together. She ran out of the room, but the damage was done. Everyone there had seen the truth, and there was no undoing it. The party ended abruptly after that, with most of the guests awkwardly shuffling out. Evelyn came up to me and whispered, "Well, George, you sure know how to make an exit." As for Susan, she didn't come home that night. I found out later that she'd gone to stay with a friend, unable to face the fallout. Richard, on the other hand, had apparently been dealing with his own problems. His wife had left him, taking their kids and most of their savings. I didn't feel sorry for either of them. They'd made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. The aftermath of the party was nothing short of a domino effect. Susan's perfectly maintained image crumbled faster than I'd anticipated. By the following week, her name was the talk of every gathering in town. People whispered about what had unfolded that night, and those who once admired her suddenly found reasons to steer clear. But I wasn't about to let things end there. Susan and her lover had gotten away with too much for too long. It was time they both faced the consequences, not just socially, but in every aspect of their lives. First, I worked with Ted, my lawyer, to finalize the divorce paperwork. With all the evidence I'd gathered, Susan had no leverage. I requested an expedited process and submitted motions to block her from claiming spousal support. Her infidelity, combined with documented misuse of our joint finances, was more than enough to ensure a favorable outcome for me. Then there was the matter of Richard. My investigator had uncovered some interesting details about his business practices, including financial irregularities that bordered on outright fraud. Using the contacts I'd built over the years, I anonymously tipped off both his former employer and local authorities. I didn't need to wait long for the fallout. Within weeks, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Richard was under investigation for tax evasion and suspected embezzlement. Meanwhile, Susan's attempts to reach out escalated. At first, it was the usual, voicemails filled with apologies, regret, and promises to make things right. She talked about how she'd lost her way and how our 50 years together meant more to her than anything. When I didn't respond, her tone changed. The messages became angry, filled with accusations that I was being cruel and vindictive. She claimed I was ruining her life and insisted I was the one who had pushed her toward Richard. The irony was almost laughable. I made it clear to her lawyer I wouldn't engage. Every message, every call, forwarded directly to Ted. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. She had made her bed, and now she could lie in it. One evening, my eldest son, Mark, called. "Dad, have you heard about Mom?" he asked hesitantly. "No," I said, though I had a feeling I knew where this was going. "She's been staying with Aunt Linda," he explained. "And, well, Richard's gone. He left her." I couldn't help but chuckle. "Of course, he did," I said. "That's what men like him do. They take what they want and leave when things get tough." Mark was quiet for a moment before saying, "I'm sorry you had to go through all of this, Dad." "Don't be," I replied. If anything, this was a wake-up call. I finally get to move on, and that's something to be grateful for. By the time the divorce was finalized, Susan's life was in shambles. She walked away with far less than she'd expected, while I retained the majority of our assets. Richard, on the other hand, had skipped town entirely, leaving behind a trail of unpaid debts and a reputation so tarnished he'd never recover. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from the lies, the games, and the weight of a marriage that had become one-sided long before I realized it. It wasn't just justice, it was a fresh start. Even after the divorce was finalized, I wasn't quite done. Susan's betrayal had left a mark, not just on our marriage but on my reputation and sense of trust. If she thought she could slip quietly into obscurity, she was sorely mistaken. People like her and Richard thrive on others staying silent, and I wasn't about to give them that luxury. The opportunity came when a mutual friend, Ellen, invited me to speak at an upcoming charity gala we had both supported for years. Susan and I used to attend it as a couple, but this year, I'd be showing up solo for the first time. Ellen offered me the stage to say a few words about our shared history with the organization. What better place to address the truth in front of the very people who had supported us as a couple all these years? On the night of the gala, I arrived early, dressed in a crisp suit that reminded me of the man I used to be before this mess began. The room was filled with familiar faces, neighbors, old friends, even some of Susan's former yoga buddies. As I scanned the crowd, I noticed a few surprised glances. No doubt they were wondering why Susan wasn't by my side. The evening progressed smoothly until it was my turn to speak. I approached the podium, my prepared notes in hand, though I had no intention of reading them. Instead, I spoke from the heart. "Good evening, everyone," I began. For 50 years, my wife and I attended this event together. We built a life, a family, and a community with many of you. But tonight, I stand here alone because, as it turns out, the foundation of what I thought we'd built was cracked. The room went silent. All eyes were on me. I could feel the weight of their curiosity, their desire to know more. "I won't bore you with the details," I continued. "But let's just say that trust, once broken, can't be repaired with apologies or excuses. It's earned, not demanded. And when someone shows you who they truly are, believe them." I paused, letting the words sink in. For those of you who've heard rumors, let me confirm, yes, Susan and I are no longer together. And no, this wasn't a mutual decision. It was one born out of necessity, because when someone betrays you so deeply, there's no turning back. I didn't need to say more. The room erupted in murmurs, some sympathetic, others shocked. I stepped down from the podium, shaking hands with a few people who offered words of support. One woman, a friend of Susan's, pulled me aside. "I'm so sorry, George," she said. I had no idea. "Neither did I replied. Until it was too late. Meanwhile, Richard's downfall continued to unfold. The investigation into his finances had escalated, and he was now facing potential legal charges. From what I heard, he'd moved to a different state to avoid the shame, leaving behind a legacy of burned bridges and unpaid debts. As for Susan, she had become somewhat of a recluse. The woman who once thrived on attention now avoided the very people she used to charm. Her attempts to rebuild her social circle had failed spectacularly. People simply didn't trust her anymore. That night, as I left the gala, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming my dignity. I had faced the storm and come out stronger, and now, I was finally ready to move forward. The day I walked out of that courtroom, divorce papers in hand, I didn't feel the sadness I expected. Instead, there was relief, like a heavy weight had finally been lifted. 50 years is a long time to share a life with someone, and while there were good moments, the betrayal had overshadowed them all. Now, for the first time in decades, I had a blank slate, and I wasn't about to waste it. I started small, easing into this new chapter of my life. The first thing I did was revisit some old hobbies I'd left behind over the years. I dusted off my fishing gear and spent mornings by the lake near my condo, just listening to the water and waiting for a bite. It reminded me of simpler times, before life became so complicated. One day, while fishing, I struck up a conversation with a fellow angler named Dave. He was in his 60s, recently retired, and had a quick wit that made the hours fly by. We started meeting up regularly, not just to fish but to swap stories and share laughs. It felt good to build new connections that weren't tied to my past life. I also decided to tackle something I'd always been curious about, cooking. Susan had always run the kitchen in our house, and I'd never had much reason to learn. But now, it was just me, and I figured it was time to fend for myself. I enrolled in a beginner's cooking class at a local community center. The first few sessions were messy. I burned a pan trying to make scrambled eggs, but eventually, I got the hang of it. Cooking became more than a necessity, it was therapy. There was something calming about chopping vegetables or watching dough rise. It gave me a sense of control, something that had felt so elusive over the past few years. But the most unexpected change came during a weekend trip to Asheville. I'd gone there on a whim, wanting to see the Blue Ridge Mountains again. While wandering through a local art fair, I stumbled upon a stall selling handmade pottery. Behind the table stood a woman named Evelyn. She had kind eyes, a warm smile, and a laugh that instantly put me at ease. We struck up a conversation, and before I knew it, an hour had passed. Evelyn shared how she'd started pottery after retiring from teaching and how it had given her a sense of purpose. She asked about my life, and I told her just enough, leaving out the messier details, for her to understand I was starting over. By the end of the day, I walked away with a small clay vase and her phone number. Over the next few weeks, we stayed in touch, meeting for coffee and eventually dinner. Evelyn wasn't just a distraction, and she was a reminder that life could still hold joy, even after everything I'd been through. As for Susan, I heard through mutual friends that she was living with her sister and trying to pick up the pieces. Richard had vanished, probably running from both his debts and his ruined reputation. But I didn't dwell on them anymore. They were part of my past, and I had no intention of letting them overshadow my future. This new chapter wasn't about revenge or regret. It was about rediscovery of who I was and what truly mattered. To anyone listening, and no matter how much time has passed or how deep the wounds feel, it's never too late to start again. Sometimes, the hardest endings lead to the most meaningful beginnings.